You know the DeLorean. Even if you've never seen one on a road, you've watched it fly across a cinema screen, the silver time machine with the doors that lift to the sky, the most famous car in the history of film. What almost nobody remembers is where it came from. 2,500 workers built it by hand in West Belfast, at the worst of the Troubles, Catholic and Protestant side by side on the same line. They raised a gleaming factory from a boggy field in 28 months, in a city where building sites were targets. They trained a workforce that had never built anything. They held their fragile peace through the hunger strikes, through everything the Troubles threw at the gates. And then, after barely a few years of making, the factory fell silent, and the people who built the most famous car in the world never worked again. How does the factory behind the car everyone remembers simply vanish? Chapter 1. The Immigrant's Son. This story begins a long way from Belfast. It begins in Detroit, in the January cold of 1925, in a house on the city's Near East Side where the heating couldn't be relied upon and the man of the house couldn't either. That's where John Zachary DeLorean was born, the eldest of 4 boys, the son of a man who'd crossed an ocean to build motorcars and never quite forgiven the world for what it did to him once he got there. His father, Zachary, had come from a mountain village in Romania called Shugag. He found work at Ford as a millwright, a foundry man, one of the tens of thousands of hands that made Detroit the workshop of the world. But his English never came right, and in a place that measured a man by how well he could talk his way up, that kept him down. He drank, he raged, and when John was still a boy, his parents' marriage came apart under the weight of it. His mother, Catherine, took work where she could, shifts for General Electric, and held what was left of the family together. So, the boy grew up watching a skilled man be broken by a system that had no use for him beyond his hands. Hold on to that. Because decades later, when John DeLorean sat down to write about the great corporations of America, the thing that made him angriest wasn't the money or the politics. It was the contempt he'd seen shown to the working man. He'd learned it early, at his own kitchen table. He was clever, though, fiercely so. He won a scholarship to the Lawrence Institute of Technology, was drafted into the army in 1943, served his 3 years, and came home to finish his engineering degree. He tried selling insurance for a while and hated it. Then he found his way to Chrysler's Engineering Institute, and from there to Packard. And it was at Packard that the young DeLorean showed what he was. There was a troublesome automatic transmission that nobody could quite make behave. He took it apart, understood it, and made it work. That was the thing about DeLorean. The thing people forgot later when he became a magazine cover instead of a man. He could actually do it. He wasn't a salesman playing at engineering. He was an engineer who happened to look like a film star. And General Motors noticed. In 1956, he jumped to Pontiac, then the dowdiest division in the whole empire, under a boss named Seaman Knudsen. Everyone called him Bunky. Pontiac built sensible cars for sensible people, and it was dying of its own respectability. DeLorean helped change that. By 1961, he was Pontiac's chief engineer, and in 1964, he did the thing that made his name for good. The rules inside GM said a mid-size Pontiac Tempest could only be fitted with a small engine. DeLorean and his people took a big 389 cubic inch V8, a great slab of an engine meant for the heavy cars, and they dropped it into the Tempest anyway. They called it the GTO. It was fast, it was loud, and it was cheap enough for a young man with a wage packet to buy on a Friday. It broke the rules, and in breaking them, it invented something that hadn't existed the week before. The muscle car. A whole culture of American youth came roaring out of that single act of quiet insubordination. The men above him should perhaps have been worried by a lieutenant who won by ignoring the rulebook. Instead, they promoted him. In 1965, at the age of 40, John DeLorean became the youngest man ever to run a division in the history of General Motors. He was just getting started. They handed him Chevrolet, the biggest division of them all, a sprawling thing that had grown slack and hard to steer. He turned it around so completely that in 1971, Chevrolet became the first division in the American motor industry to sell more than 3 million vehicles in a single year. By 1972, he was a vice president of the largest company on Earth, and the whispers in Detroit had already begun. This one might run the whole thing someday. But he didn't look like a man who ran General Motors. He looked like something else entirely. He'd had his jaw reshaped and his hair dyed dark. He wore Italian suits cut close to a body he kept lean at 6'4". He grew his sideburns long, played the saxophone and dated Hollywood, Ursula Andress, Tina Sinatra. He bought pieces of the New York Yankees and the San Diego Chargers because he could. He was earning something like $650,000 a year, and he spent it like a man who fully intended to be looked at. The grey men on the 14th floor of GM's headquarters did not know what to do with him. And in 1973, at the very height of it all, John DeLorean walked away. Chapter 2. The Man Who Walked Away. Some said he was pushed. Some said he jumped. What's certain is that a man who might have inherited the greatest industrial fortune in the world chose instead to leave it, and then to tell everyone exactly why. He sat down with a journalist named J. Patrick Wright and produced a book. On a clear day you can see General Motors, they called it. And when it appeared in 1979, it sold more than 1.5 million copies. It was a demolition. It tore into what DeLorean named the 14th floor, the culture of executives so wrapped in comfort and consensus that they'd lost the ability to make an honest decision. One chapter was titled, How Moral Men Make Immoral Decisions. He wrote that as he'd climbed inside the corporation, he'd come into conflict with it. Conflict with its philosophy of business. Conflict with its system of management. Conflict with the people who held its power. And he came back again to the lesson from that kitchen table in Detroit. Among all the layers of management at GM, he wrote, there were men with an outright contempt for the working person, men to whom the worker was someone devoid of integrity and purpose. That contempt was not an abstraction to DeLorean, and it wasn't a pose struck for a book. He'd run Chevrolet. He'd stood on those assembly lines. He knew that the men who built the cars and the men who decided the car's fate had, by the 1970s, become two entirely different species who never met. Decisions that ended thousands of working lives were taken by people who had never smelled a foundry, never felt a line vibrate under their boots, never watched a good man's back give out at 50 from doing the same lift 10,000 times a day. To them, it was arithmetic. And DeLorean, the boy from the Near East Side, whose own father had been arithmetic to men like these, could not stomach it. Or said he couldn't. The question of how much of John DeLorean was conviction and how much was performance is one that will haunt this entire story. Because in Belfast, the conviction would turn out to be real, and so, catastrophically, would the performance. Here, then, was a man who believed he could do it better. Build a better company. Build a better car, one that was safe, honest, made to last. An ethical motor car, he called it. The very opposite of the disposable machines Detroit turned out to keep the money moving. And he'd build it in a factory where the people on the floor were treated as something more than a line on a cost sheet. It was a beautiful idea, and beautiful ideas need money. He founded the DeLorean Motor Company on the 24th of October 1975, and he raised the money the way only a man of his particular glamour could. There were loans arranged through the Bank of America. There were celebrity investors, drawn by his name and his certainty. The talk show king Johnny Carson put money in, and so did Sammy Davis Jr. and the country singer Roy Clark. There was a shrewd scheme that had car dealers across America paying cash up front for the right to sell a car that did not yet exist, and there was, above all, the promise of government help. Because a man building a factory that would create thousands of jobs was a man that governments, in the right circumstances, would fall over themselves to talk to. Beside him, through all of it, stood his wife, Christina Ferrare, a model and actress, the Max Factor girl, 25 years younger than him, whose beauty in the magazines matched the shine of the car he was promising. Together, they were something the motor industry had never produced. Not executives, celebrities. The DeLoreans belonged on the covers, and they knew it. The dream had a clear shape in his head now. What he needed was to give it a shape you could actually see. Chapter 3. The Shape of the Future. In 1974, DeLorean went to Turin, to the studio of Giorgetto Giugiaro, the most celebrated car designer alive. Giugiaro drew him something extraordinary, a low, sharp, folded wedge that echoed a concept car he'd built years before called the Tapiro. It sat close to the road. It had doors that opened upward, like wings. It looked less like a motor car than like something that had quietly landed in the night. The first prototype was finished in October 1976, built under a chief engineer named William Collins, who'd followed DeLorean out of Pontiac. They called it the DSV-1, the DeLorean safety vehicle, because safety was meant to be the entire point of the enterprise. The production version got a plainer name, and it came from the price. DeLorean wanted to sell the car for $12,000, so the car became the DMC-12. But there was a problem underneath the beautiful skin, and it was a serious one. The clever engineering that was meant to make the car special simply didn't work. The plan had called for a rotary engine mounted in the middle of the car and a lightweight chassis made from a novel composite molding process. On paper, it read like the future. In the metal, it was close to unbuildable. Not at the price DeLorean was quoting, not on the timescale he was promising, not to the standard a road car needed. He had a magnificent body and no dependable way to make it move. The whole dream could have died right there in the workshop before a single customer ever saw it. So DeLorean did what he had always done. He went and found the best man alive for the job. In 1978, he turned to Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus, the most brilliant and least conventional engineer in British motorsport. A man whose entire philosophy could be summed up in 3 words: add lightness, simplify. Chapman looked at the DeLorean's unproven ideas and swept them away. In their place, he gave the car a steel backbone chassis, closely related to the one beneath his own Lotus Esprit. He clad it in a fiberglass underbody, and over the top of that, he hung those famous panels of brushed stainless steel, unpainted, faintly industrial, showing every fingerprint, unlike the bodywork of any other car on any road in the world. The upward opening doors, the gull-wings, were made to actually function using torsion bars developed alongside the aerospace engineers at Grumman. And where the rotary engine had failed, Chapman fitted a proven 2.85-litre V6, built jointly by Peugeot, Renault and Volvo, and mounted it behind the rear wheels. It was, at last, a car that could be built. Chapman had rescued DeLorean's dream from a collapse that would have come before the story even properly began. That's the thing to remember about Colin Chapman, and we'll come back to him. Because the arrangement DeLorean made to pay him for that rescue, the precise, secret route by which the money travelled, would one day help bring the whole shining edifice crashing down. But that was invisible in 1978, buried, years away. For now, there was only the car, silver, winged, ready to be born. And one question left to answer: where on earth would it be built? Chapter 4. A Factory on the Fault Line. John DeLorean took his dream around the world like an auction lot and let governments bid for it. He looked at Limerick in the Republic of Ireland, but the Irish minister Desmond O'Malley studied the figures, decided the whole proposition was all too good to be true, and turned him down flat. He looked hard at Puerto Rico, at a former Air Force base at Aguadilla, and got so close to a deal that Puerto Rican representatives were reportedly sitting in a New York hotel with the contracts, waiting to sign. They never got the chance. Because another bidder had come to the table with an offer nobody on earth could match, and the reasons behind it had almost nothing to do with motorcars. In the late 1970s, West Belfast had the highest unemployment in the entire industrialised world. In some streets, half the men had no work at all. Many of them had never worked a day in their lives. The Troubles were at their bloodiest, and the British government, then Labour under the Prime Minister James Callaghan, had come to a hard and genuine conviction that a man with no job and no hope was a man the IRA could reach. Roy Mason, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, took DeLorean's factory to the cabinet and championed it as a matter of the utmost political, social and psychological importance. He called it a potential hammer blow to the IRA. He told Callaghan, in as many words, that it could save soldiers' lives, because to give a young man in Twinbrook a wage packet was to give him something to lose and a reason to stay out of the fight. And so the money came, and it came astonishingly fast. The whole enormous deal, a factory, a workforce of thousands, tens of millions of pounds of public money, was hammered out in something like 45 days. It was done despite the fact that America's own financial regulator had already looked at DeLorean's numbers and warned investors to stay well clear. In the end, the British commitment would swell to around £77 million of taxpayers' money. It remains one of the largest bets any British government has ever placed on a single private company. They chose a site called The Cuts at Dunmurry, on the edge of the city. 72 acres of marshy cow pasture. But it was where those acres sat that told the real story. The land lay directly along the seam that split Belfast from itself, On one side, the Catholic Republican estate of Twinbrook, where a young man named Bobby Sands lived. On the other, the Protestant streets of Seymour Hill. So they built the factory with two gates, one gate facing Twinbrook, one gate facing Seymour Hill, two separate doors into the same building so that men and women who would not walk the same streets could still somehow walk the same factory floor. On the 2nd of October, 1978, John DeLorean stood on that boggy ground beside the Labour Minister Don Concannon and broke the earth. What happened next was, by any honest measure, a small miracle. The architect Gerald Mooney laid out 6 great buildings across some 660,000 square feet. The contractors, Farrens and McLaughlin and Harvey, put them up in roughly 16 months. From peat bog to a working motorcar factory with its own test track took about 28 months. That pace would be thought ambitious on a quiet greenfield site today. In late 1970s Belfast, it was close to unthinkable, because building sites were targets, and the men who worked them carried their lives in their hands each morning they clocked on. But it rose. The stainless dream got its stainless cathedral, and it gleamed there on the fault line of a broken city. They hired the workers young, most of them, and most had never held a proper job in their lives. Men like Joe Murray, who was so taken with the terms on offer, the wages, the conditions, the sheer good fortune of it, that he kept his application form and his acceptance letter for the rest of his days. Every single employee on their first day was handed a duffel coat, 2 pairs of overalls, and 2 pairs of boots. For a family in West Belfast in 1980, that alone was a small miracle. A wage, proper kit, a door with your name expected behind it in the morning. But you cannot build the most futuristic car on earth with hands that have never built anything. So the factory did something remarkable. To train its raw recruits, it turned out several hundred practice cars with plain black fiberglass panels instead of gleaming steel. The workers called them the black cars, or the mules. Shift after shift, week after week, the untried young men and women of Twinbrook and Seymour Hill learned their trade on the mules, until their hands knew the work. And then, at the start of 1981, it was ready. The first production car was announced on the 21st of January. That spring, a man named Neil Barclay stood at the docks compound, where the first finished cars were being loaded for America. It was Easter, the shipment bound for Long Beach, California. Barclay had a camera, and he photographed the moment. Years later, he'd say it plainly. He'd known, standing there, that this was history in the making. He was right about that, though not in the way he hoped. 2.5 years earlier, this site had been a field where cattle grazed in the shadow of a war. Now it was building the future, boxing it up, and shipping it across the Atlantic. And the men and women who built it had something almost nobody in West Belfast had known for a generation. A good job, a full wage packet on a Friday, and a reason to feel proud walking through the gates on a Monday morning. Either gate. It didn't matter which. They could not have known how little time was left to them. But that comes later. For now, the gates stood open, both of them, and the cars were rolling. Chapter 5. The people who built it. The car was the dream, but the factory was the people, and it's the people we need to know now, because everything that follows only matters if you understand who was standing on that floor. They came from both sides. That was the whole point, and the miracle of it should not be lost under the more famous drama of what came later. Belfast in 1980 was a city where a Catholic from Twinbrook and a Protestant from Seymour Hill lived a few hundred yards apart and might go their whole lives without a civil word between them. The peace lines were real. The murders were real. And into the middle of that, on a stretch of reclaimed bog, DeLorean's factory asked them to build something together. Not to reconcile, not to make speeches, just to come in through their own gate, put on their overalls and stand shoulder to shoulder on the same production line, making the same car. And they did. A mechanic named David Winnington had a word for what the factory became. He called it an oasis. Inside those walls, for the length of a shift, the tension that governed every other hour of a Belfast life simply eased. There was too much to do to keep score of who prayed where. A man passed you a panel, you fitted it, you passed the next man, the next thing. Catholic hands and Protestant hands, building the future of a company owned by a Detroit millionaire who wore Italian suits, in a car destined for the boulevards of California. The strangeness of it was part of the wonder of it. John Mageean was one of the instructors, a problem solver who worked on the interior trims and taught the younger hands their craft. Decades on, an old man by then, he described those days without a shadow of bitterness. He'd had a fantastic time, he said. Everyone knew it was a new venture, and everyone buckled down and worked hard. People wanted a trade, something that would stand them in good stead, whatever came after. That was the hunger in the place. Not just a wage, though God knows the wage mattered. A skill, a thing you could do that no one could take off you. Joe Murray, the painter and decorator who kept his acceptance letter like a relic, put it more simply still. He was, in his own word, a fanatic. The terms were great, the money was fantastic, and DeLorean himself, when he swept through, tall and silver and impossible, was a very charismatic man. When the boss walked the floor, people stood a little straighter. He had that effect. Whatever else he was, and he was a great many things, John DeLorean could make a room full of working people from West Belfast believe they were building something that would matter to the world. The truth is, it wasn't quite an oasis. The troubles were too big to keep entirely outside the gates, and there was one moment, in 1981, when they came right through the doors. That was the year of the hunger strikes. Bobby Sands, who had lived in Twinbrook, in the very shadow of the factory, was starving himself to death in the Maze prison, a few miles away, and the Republican half of Belfast was in agony over it. When the news reached its worst, half the DeLorean workforce downed tools and walked out in an impromptu protest. Some of the workers made a banner of a DeLorean car smashing through a giant letter H for the H blocks, where the men were dying. And there is a story, told by one worker to the writer Glenn Patterson years afterward, that every second car coming off the line carried a message scratched into the stainless steel behind the dashboard, where no customer would ever see it. A few defiant words, or a small candle entwined in barbed wire, the symbol of the hunger strike. If it's true, then somewhere out in the world, in the hands of collectors who have no idea, there are DeLoreans carrying the grief of West Belfast hidden in their bodywork to this day. So, it was not a perfect piece, but it held. The line kept moving, and the men and women came back in the next morning, through their 2 gates, and built the next car. There was an executive named Barry Wills, the director of purchasing, who understood exactly what he was watching. The workforce, he said, could not possibly have worked more closely together, and he came to believe something that sounds extravagant until you sit with it, that if DeLorean had succeeded, if the factory had lived and grown and put down 40 years of roots, it might have accelerated the peace in Northern Ireland by years, not through politics, through the simple, daily, unglamorous fact of 2 communities discovering they could build something together and both take the wage home. Wills would spend years afterward campaigning, without much success, for a proper heritage centre at Dunmurry, a titanic Belfast for the car. The ship and the car, he liked to say, were both failures, but they were both glorious failures. Hold that phrase, glorious failure, because the glory was already here in 1981, in the hands of Joe Murray and John Mageean and David Winnington and 2,500 others who'd come from nothing and were now building the future. And the failure was coming. It was already coming, in fact, already set in motion in an accountant's office and a Geneva apartment, before most of these people had fitted their first panel. They just couldn't see it yet. Nobody on that floor could. All they could see was the work in front of them, and the car taking shape under their hands, and the extraordinary, ordinary dignity of a full week's wage in a city that had forgotten what that felt like. The gates were open, both of them, and for one shining stretch of months, everything worked. Chapter 6. The car takes shape. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what it took to make one of these cars, because a DeLorean was not stamped out the way Detroit stamped out its millions. It was assembled, panel by panel, by hand, in a building that had been a bog 3 years before. It began at the back of the site, where the raw stuff arrived. Steel came in for the backbone chassis, that spine Colin Chapman had borrowed from the Lotus Esprit and stretched to carry a heavier car. Great sheets of SAE 304 stainless arrived to be pressed and finished into the panels, a grade of steel chosen because it wouldn't rust, wouldn't need paint, and would wear its brushed silver skin forever. In theory. In practice, that same steel would show every fingerprint a hand ever laid on it, and the men on the line learned to work in gloves and to wince when a visitor reached out to touch. The fiberglass underbody was molded on site, a pale shell that would never be seen once the car was finished, the hidden body beneath the famous skin. Onto the chassis went the running gear, and at the very back, slung out behind the rear axle, the engine, that 2.85-litre V6, shipped up from the continent, the joint work of Peugeot, Renault, and Volvo. Mounting it back there gave the car a strange balance, roughly a third of its weight over the front wheels and two-thirds over the back, a distribution that made it dart and skitter in ways the road testers would later have plenty to say about. Then came the doors, the gull-wings, the single feature that made a DeLorean, the thing that turned heads in a car park from 100 yards. They were counterbalanced by torsion bars worked out with the aerospace engineers at Grumman, so that a door weighing what it weighed could be lifted with one finger and would hang there, open to the sky, like a bird about to take flight. Getting them to sit right, to close flush, to seal against the weather, to not sag over time, was one of the hardest jobs on the whole floor, and one of the ones that would give the factory the most grief. There was a rhythm to the place once it hit full production. The morning shift arriving through the two gates, the hum of the line coming up to speed, the particular sounds of a body shop and an assembly hall, the hiss and thump of the presses shaping stainless, the whine of tools, the calling back and forth of men and women who'd known each other now for a year and had become, in that strange reclaimed field, something like a single working family. It was a young workforce. The average age on that floor was startlingly low, and there was, by every account that survives, a genuine pride in it. The pride of people who had been told they were unemployable, building something the whole world was talking about. And through all of it moved the people of Twinbrook and Seymour Hill, fitting, checking, adjusting, the hands that had learned their trade on the black mules, now laying stainless steel over the future. A young lad who'd never held a job was now torquing suspension bolts on a car bound for Beverly Hills. A woman fitting interior trim in Dunmurry was stitching the cabin that some film producer in Los Angeles would slide into on a Saturday night. The distance between that factory floor and that customer was 10,000 miles and about 100 social classes, and it was bridged every single day by a workforce that a year earlier the world had written off entirely. That was the Golden Age. It's important to say plainly how short it was, because the story usually gets told as though DeLorean had decades and squandered them. He didn't. The whole living, breathing, car-producing life of that factory lasted a little over a year. But for that year, that one bright year, it was real. The cars were good enough to sell. The line was running. The wages were paid. And in the spring of 1981, the first of them sailed for America to meet the country that had dreamed them up. Chapter 7. The Silver Car Meets America. When the DeLorean landed in the United States, it landed like a spacecraft. Nothing on the American road looked like it. In a nation of painted steel and soft suspension and chrome, here was a low, unpainted silver wedge with doors that opened towards the heavens. It had been designed in Italy by Giugiaro, engineered in England by Chapman, built in Ireland by people the American buyer would never meet, and it had arrived to be sold as the personal creation of the most glamorous man the motor industry had ever produced. It was, for a few months, the most talked-about car in America. And they wanted it. That's the part that gets forgotten in the shadow of everything that came after. There was, at the start, genuine desire. There was a waiting list. There were buyers pressing money on dealers to jump the queue, paying over the list price for a car that had cost $12,000 only in DeLorean's original dream, and now sold for around $25,000. That was a serious sum in 1981, near enough what you'd pay for a Porsche 911, a car with a pedigree the DeLorean could only aspire to. But people paid it because the DeLorean wasn't really selling speed or handling. It was selling the future, and the man who embodied it, and the feeling of stepping out of those upward doors in front of a restaurant and watching every head on the street turn. The best of it came in October 1981. In that single month, DeLorean dealers across America sold 720 cars. It was the high water mark, the most the company would ever sell in 1 month, in the whole of its short life. For those few weeks, the numbers looked like the numbers of a company that was going to make it, a stainless steel American dream, built by Irish hands, flying out of the showrooms. You can imagine how it felt back in Dunmurry when word came through of a month like that. The workers knew their cars were selling. They knew the factory that had risen from a cow pasture was supplying showrooms in California and Florida and New York. They had every reason, that autumn, to believe they were at the beginning of something, and not the end of it. The great man himself was everywhere in the press, on the covers, on the chat shows, the silver-haired visionary who'd walked out on General Motors and built the car of tomorrow in the last place on earth anyone would have chosen. It was, for a moment, the best story in the business. But here is where the story turns, and it turns not on a villain's decision, but on a piece of arithmetic that was already, quietly, fatal. Because for all the desire, for all the waiting lists, and the 720 cars of October, the company was building them far faster than America was buying them. And the gap between those two numbers, the cars made and the cars sold, was opening into a chasm that no amount of glamour could close. Chapter 8. Beautiful and Flawed. The reviews came in, and they were the first cold draft through the open door. The motoring press wanted to love the DeLorean. Everyone did. But the writers who drove it could not, in honesty, report that the car lived up to the way it looked. The problem was under the skin. That V6 out the back produced, in American trim, around 130 horsepower. A modest figure for a car that promised so much menace just standing still. DeLorean's people claimed it would reach 60 miles an hour from rest in 8.5 seconds. When Road and Track put a stopwatch on it, they got 10.5. The Chapman redesign, for all its brilliance, had left the finished car something like 500 pounds heavier than the original plan, and the engine simply hadn't the muscle to move that weight the way the bodywork promised. It looked like it could outrun anything. It couldn't outrun a good family saloon. And then there was the quality. This is the hardest part to tell, because it's no reflection on the workers. It's a reflection on a factory that had gone from bog to full production in 28 months, staffed by people learning the trade as they built the cars the world was already buying. Early DeLoreans came off the boat in America with problems. Doors that didn't fit as they should. Panels that showed every mark. Electrical faults. Weak alternators that could leave a driver stranded at the roadside in a car that had cost as much as a Porsche. It happened to Johnny Carson himself, one of DeLorean's own celebrity investors, the man whose late-night blessing had helped raise the money. Left standing beside a dead DeLorean. When your investors are being stranded by your own product, word travels, and it travels fast in a town like Los Angeles. The company's answer to all this tells you everything about the trap it was in. Rather than send faulty cars back across the Atlantic, DeLorean set up what were called quality assurance centers at the American ports where the cars arrived. These were, in plain terms, workshops whose job was to fix the cars before the customer ever saw them. To rework, off the boat, what the factory hadn't got right the first time. It was a sensible short-term fix and a slow financial poison. Every car reworked at the dockside cost money the company did not have to spare, on top of the money it had already spent building the thing in Dunmurry. The cars were expensive to make, expensive to ship, and now expensive to fix, and they were still selling for less than all of that added up to. A company cannot survive selling its product for less than it costs to deliver. No company ever has. None of this reached the factory floor as a warning, not clearly. The workers in Dunmurry were building to a schedule, and the schedule was full, and a full schedule feels like success. Why would you doubt it? The cars were leaving. The wages were coming. The great man swept through in his Italian suits and told them they were building the future. But the future was made of arithmetic, and the arithmetic had turned against them, and somewhere above the factory floor a decision was being taken that would turn a difficult year into a fatal one. Chapter 9. The peak that was already the fall. Here is the number that breaks the story in half. By the end of 1981, the very year of the waiting lists and the 720 cars of October, the DeLorean Motor Company had built around 7,500 cars, and it had sold around 3,000 of them. Read those two numbers again, because everything else follows from the space between them. For every DeLorean that found an owner, more than one sat unsold, in compounds, at the docks, in dealer lots, a growing silver herd of the most futuristic car on Earth that nobody was buying. The company had built more than twice what the market would take. Any business can survive a bad month. What no business survives is building at twice the rate it sells, month after month, while each car costs more to make than it earns. The break-even point for the Dunmurry factory was reckoned at somewhere between 10 and 12,000 cars a year. Real, honest, sustainable demand for the DeLorean, the number of people who actually wanted one at the price, and would part with the money for it, was probably around 6,000. The factory needed to sell nearly twice as many cars as the world wished to buy, simply to stop losing money. That was the machine John DeLorean had built. Magnificent and mathematically doomed, and when the moment came to face it, DeLorean made a choice that historians have puzzled over ever since. Confronted with a mountain of unsold cars, he did not cut production. He doubled it. It was, in its way, an act of pure faith. Faith in his own certainty that the demand was out there, that America simply hadn't caught up yet, that if he flooded the market would rise to meet him. It was the same instinct that had dropped a big engine into a small Pontiac and invented the muscle car, the same instinct that had built a factory in a war zone in 28 months. Back yourself, override the doubters, make it real by sheer will. It had worked so many times before. It had built his whole legend. This time it drove the company off a cliff, and it did so just as the world outside turned cold, in every sense. Because the winter that came, the winter of 1981 into 1982, brought some of the worst snowstorms in living memory to the American Northeast, which happened to be the DeLorean's main market. Nobody buys an impractical two-seat sports car with the roads buried under a foot of snow. At the same time, a hard recession had gripped the United States. Interest rates had climbed towards 20%, and the dollar was strong, all of which strangled exactly the kind of discretionary, dream purchase spending that a car like the DeLorean depended on entirely. The unsold herd grew, the cash drained away, and in January 1982, the American financial regulator forced the cancellation of a planned share issue that was meant to bring in around $27 million, money the company needed now, simply to breathe. Standing in the autumn of 1981 at the summit, nobody on that factory floor in Dunmurry could see any of this coming. They saw a record sales month. They saw a full order book. They saw the great man smiling. They had no way of knowing that the peak they were standing on was not the base of a mountain but the edge of a drop, that the very success of October was built on cars the company couldn't afford to have made, sold into a market that was about to freeze solid. The highest point, and the beginning of the fall. In the DeLorean story, they are almost the same moment, separated by a few weeks and one number nobody wanted to say aloud. And the cruelest part, the part that turns this from a business failure into a genuine tragedy, is that the money which might have saved them all was already gone. It had been gone for years. It had vanished before the first stainless panel was ever pressed, siphoned quietly out of the enterprise through a shell company in a Geneva apartment, and not one of the men and women building cars in Dunmurry had the faintest idea. That is where we have to go next, into the missing money. Because to understand how the factory really died, you have to follow the $17 million that never arrived, and the desperate, catastrophic thing a cornered man did when he finally understood it was gone. Chapter 10. The money that was never there. To understand how the factory died, you have to go back before it was born. In 1978, before the foundations were poured at Dunmurry, before a single ton of stainless steel was ordered, John DeLorean needed to pay Colin Chapman and Lotus for the enormous job of turning his unbuildable dream into a car that could actually be made. It was legitimate work, some of the most important engineering in the whole enterprise, and Lotus was owed serious money for it. In the end, Lotus billed DeLorean directly for around $23 million. But that is not the route the money took. Or rather, it is not the only route. Alongside the honest billing, a second channel was opened. And to understand it, you have to picture not a factory, but an apartment, a flat in Geneva, in Switzerland, out of which was run a company that existed almost entirely on paper. It was called GPD Services, General Product Development. It was registered not in Switzerland and not in Britain, but in Panama, a jurisdiction favoured, then as now, by people who would rather their affairs were not easily followed. The people at the Geneva end were a man named Jerry Juhan and his wife, Marie Denise, and through this company, this apartment, this Panamanian shell, flowed a great river of money. The figures are worth stating precisely because they were later stated precisely under oath and in Parliament. Some $5 million came from the DeLorean company in Belfast itself. More came from an American research partnership DeLorean had set up. The total that passed through GPD Services came to around $17.5 million. $17.65 million to be exact. a number that would one day be read aloud in the Mother of Parliaments in Westminster, as a monument to how badly public money can be lost. Here is what the receivers found when they finally pulled that channel apart. Of that $17.5 million, none of it, not $1, reached Lotus. Lotus had already been paid directly for its work, the $23 million, billed and settled. The GPD money was something else entirely. It was money for engineering services that Lotus had, on paper, supposedly provided through this intermediary. But the engineering had already been paid for by another door, and when the accountants traced where the GPD money actually went, they reached a conclusion that would define the whole affair. It had been split 3 ways, between John DeLorean, between Colin Chapman, and between Lotus's finance director, a quiet, careful man named Fred Bushell. The chairman of the British Parliament's Public Accounts Committee would later put it in words that lost none of their force for being so restrained. Over $17 million, he said, had been misappropriated without detection by the very people whose job was to monitor the project. He called it one of the gravest cases of the misuse of public resources to come before the committee in many years. A shocking misappropriation of public and private money. This was not a journalist's accusation. This was the settled finding of the British state, examining what had become of its own citizens' money, and some of DeLorean's share left a trail. According to reporting at the time, roughly half of the money was later traced to an account DeLorean used to buy a snowcat manufacturer in Utah, a company that made the great tracked machines that groom ski slopes, motorcars in Belfast, snow machines in the Rocky Mountains. The money meant to build the future of West Belfast had gone, in part, to buy a business, grooming the pistes for wealthy American skiers. Now hold all of this against everything you already know about what came next. When the factory hit its crisis in late 1981 and early 1982, when the cars were piling up unsold, when the share issue collapsed, when the company was gasping for cash simply to survive, the sums it needed to keep breathing were, at various points, a matter of a few £1,000,000, $10 million to satisfy one deadline, $80,000 to unlock a rescue, and $17.5 million had already been taken out of the enterprise, quietly, years before, by 3 men who were meant to be building it up rather than bleeding it out. It has been argued, with real force, that the missing GPD money alone could have kept the DeLorean Motor Company out of receivership, that the money to save 2,500 jobs in the worst unemployment black spot in Western Europe had existed, had been there, in the accounts, real and spendable, and had been spirited into a Geneva apartment before most of those workers had even been hired, before Joe Murray kept his acceptance letter, before the black mules taught untried hands their trade, before the first stainless door was ever lifted to the sky. That is the real crime of the DeLorean story, not the one that would later fill the world's front pages. This one, the quiet one, the one carried out with paperwork and offshore accounts and a flat in Switzerland, years before anyone was arrested, years before the cameras came, the one that killed the factory before a single soul inside it knew they were in danger, and not one of them had the slightest idea. Chapter 11. The government runs out of patience. The politics had turned too, and turned hard. The deal that built Dunmurry had been made by a Labour government, by James Callaghan and Roy Mason, who saw in it a weapon against the IRA and a lifeline for a city drowning in unemployment. But in 1979, Britain elected Margaret Thatcher, and the Conservative government that came in had never liked the DeLorean subsidy. To them, it looked like precisely the kind of thing they had been elected to stop. Enormous sums of public money poured into a glamorous private venture that had never turned a profit and showed no clear sign that it ever would. To a government committed above all to fiscal discipline, DeLorean was less a triumph than an embarrassment waiting to happen. DeLorean saw it differently. He saw betrayal. He would later claim, bitterly, that his company had started under Roy Mason and Labour, and that when the Conservatives came in, they simply decided not to honour the contract that Labour had signed. He said there was a final tranche of working capital money. He put the figure at $93 million, that had been promised and never came, and that its absence was what truly put him out of business. Whether that is the whole truth or the account of a drowning man pointing at whoever held him under, the shift in London was real and it was decisive. The patience was gone. The checkbook was closing. The Northern Ireland brief passed through Conservative hands, first Humphrey Atkins, then James Pryor, and it was Pryor who brought in the man who would preside over the end. His name was Sir Kenneth Cork, one of the most respected insolvency experts in Britain, of the firm Coopers and Librand, a man whose name was practically a byword for the sober business of winding up the failed. There was a bleak irony in the appointment that would not have been lost on anyone who knew the history. Cork had, years earlier, as a former chairman of the very development agency that had funded DeLorean, opposed the original deal. He had said, in effect, that this was a bad bet. Now he was being called back to sift through the wreckage of the thing he had warned against. Cork studied the company and delivered a hard, unsentimental verdict. No more credit without a complete reorganization. The days of writing checks and hoping for the best were finished, and the news travelled, the way bad news always travels through a factory, faster than any announcement. By January 1982, the Dunmurry plant had already gone to a 3-day week. The layoffs had begun. The workers, who a few months earlier had been building the future at full tilt, were now watching their hours cut, watching the unsold cars accumulate in the compounds, hearing the whispers that run through every works in trouble, that the men in suits were circling, that London had lost its nerve, that something was coming down the line towards them, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. Something was coming, and it was very nearly here. Chapter 12. Receivership. The Day. Hope died. On the 19th of February 1982, the British government forced the DeLorean Motor Company in Belfast into receivership. This is the date, not October, not the day of the handcuffs and the headlines. This one, the 19th of February 1982. 8 months before John DeLorean was ever arrested in a Los Angeles hotel room, the fate of the Dunmurry factory was, in every way that truly mattered, already sealed. Sir Kenneth Cork and a colleague named Paul Schul were appointed as joint receivers, and with that appointment, the company stopped being John DeLorean's to run. It belonged now to the receivers, to men whose grim job was to decide whether it could be saved, sold, or simply shut down for good. The human cost fell at once, and it fell hard. Of the roughly 2,600 people working at Dunmurry, around 1,100 were made redundant almost immediately. In a single stroke, more than 1,000 of the men and women who had crossed Belfast's sectarian lines to build the most futuristic car on Earth were sent home. The oasis that David Winnington had described began to empty out, station by station, gate by gate. Think hard about what that meant in West Belfast in 1982. These were people who, in many cases, had held their first ever job at DeLorean. People who had been handed a duffel coat and 2 pairs of boots, and a reason to feel proud, in a place where half the men had never worked at all. Now, through no failing of their own, their cars were good, their line ran, their skill was genuine and hard won. They were being turned back out into the highest unemployment in the industrial world. Not because they had built badly, because the arithmetic had never worked, and because the money that might have bought them time had been quietly taken years before by men most of them had never so much as glimpsed. For a man made redundant that February, there was no soft landing waiting. There were no other factories in West Belfast crying out for skilled assembly workers. There was the dole and the long walk home to tell a family that the good years, the fantastic wages, the pride, the thing that had felt for 18 months like the beginning of a different life, were over. Some of these men had left steadier, duller jobs to chase the silver dream, because DeLorean had paid better and felt like the future. Now the future was gone and the duller jobs had been filled behind them, and there was nothing to go back to. The redundancy notices did not just end a wage. In a city with nothing else to offer, they closed a door that for many of the men who walked out through it would never open again. Production limped on through the spring at a reduced rate, the remaining workers building cars for a company now in the hands of receivers, building toward no future anyone could name. And then, at the end of May 1982, production at Dunmurry stopped. That is when the most futuristic car on Earth stopped being made. Not with handcuffs and not with headlines, but quietly, on a spring day in Belfast, when the line simply ran down and came to rest and did not start again. The presses fell silent. The particular hum of a working factory, the sound the workers would remember for the rest of their lives, thinned out and stopped. A works that has been building for even a year has an acoustic presence, a life you can hear. When that stops, what you notice is not the absence of the noise. It's the presence of a silence in the wrong shape. There was still, for a while, a flicker of hope. Cork had not entirely given up on finding a rescue, and neither had DeLorean. And for a few months through that summer, the faint possibility of resurrection hung in the air over the silent factory. But make no mistake about what had already happened. By the end of May 1982, the Golden Age was not merely over. The factory that had made the Golden Age had stopped making anything at all. Everything that came afterward, every deadline, every plan, every desperate scheme, right up to and including a hotel room in Los Angeles, was no longer the story of a living company fighting to survive. It was the story of whether the dead could be raised. Chapter 13. The Rescue That Thatcher Refused. For a few months in 1982, it looked as though the factory might yet be saved. This is the part of the story that almost nobody knows, and it is where the true heartbreak of Dunmurry actually lives, not in a hotel room in California, but in a decision taken quietly in London. Sir Kenneth Cork, the receiver, was a serious man doing a serious job, and whatever his old reservations about the deal, he did not want to watch 2,500 livelihoods vanish if there was an honest way to save even some of them. So he set a hard condition on DeLorean himself. If there was to be rescue money, John DeLorean would have to put up at least half of it out of his own pocket. No more building an empire entirely on other people's money. A deadline was set in July 1982 for DeLorean to raise around £10 million himself. It came and it went, and he could not do it. But there was another plan, and this one was real, and it was serious, and it very nearly worked. A consortium came forward with a proposal that had been examined and approved by both Cork and the Northern Ireland Secretary, James Pryor. Under this plan, DeLorean's own role would have been drastically cut back, the founder pushed to the margins of the company that still carried his name. A second, more sensible vehicle would be added to the range, so the factory had something to build beyond a single expensive and slow-selling sports car. And most important of all, the plan would have saved around 1,500 jobs, not all 2,500, but 1,500 families in West Belfast kept off the dole, kept in work, kept in the dignity of a wage. In that city, in that year, 1,500 jobs was not a statistic. It was a lifeline. The plan needed one thing to move forward. The British government had to sign off on a due diligence payment, a sum of around £80,000, so that the consortium's proposal could be properly checked over and finalised. £80,000. Set that beside the £77 million already sunk into the project. £80,000 to potentially unlock the rescue of 1,500 jobs. It went up to Margaret Thatcher for the final decision. She said no. And she said no, in part, because of what she now knew. By this point, the government had been told that $17.5 million had been taken out of the company, and that DeLorean himself was the most likely culprit. Set against that knowledge, the notion of the British taxpayer spending even £80,000 more to prop up a venture tangled up with a suspected fraud was, to Thatcher, simply unthinkable. And from where she sat, it is a defensible decision. Arguably, a responsible one. Why pour one more penny of public money into a company whose founder appeared to have quietly looted it? But that exactly, is the tragedy of it, laid bare on the table. The fraud that had bled the company in 1978 was now, in 1982, the very reason the government refused the money that might have saved 1,500 of the workers who had nothing whatever to do with it. The theft killed the factory twice over. Once by taking the money that could have kept it breathing through its worst months. And again, 4 years later, by making any rescue politically impossible, by poisoning the well so thoroughly that no minister could be seen to drink from it. Joe Murray and John McGeehan and David Winnington and 1,500 of their workmates lost their last real chance, not because of anything they did, and not even, in the end, because of the market or the snow or the interest rates. They lost it because of money stolen from over their heads before they'd ever arrived. The consortium plan collapsed, and with it went the last realistic hope of saving Dunmurry, not in October, but here, in the grey months of summer and autumn 1982, in the narrow gap between an £80,000 payment and a Prime Minister's signature that never came. And it was into this exact moment, cornered, his company in receivership, his rescue refused, his own fortune insufficient, every legitimate door in the world quietly closing in his face, that John DeLorean made the decision that would define him for the rest of his life, and long after it. Chapter 14. The One Mistake. He was out of money, out of options, and very nearly out of time, and a desperate man in that condition is a man who can be reached. There was a figure from DeLorean's past named James Timothy Hoffman, a convicted drug smuggler, a perjurer, a tax evader, and, by the summer of 1982, a paid informant for the FBI. Hoffman had once been a neighbor of DeLorean's out near his ranch in Palmer Valley in San Diego County. He knew who DeLorean was. He knew, or could easily guess, how badly the great man's fortunes had turned. And in June 1982, with the Belfast factory already in receivership, already stopped, already dead in every meaningful sense, Hoffman made contact. The first taped telephone call between them came on the 2nd of June, 1982. What was dangled in front of John DeLorean over the weeks that followed was a way out. Not a legitimate one, a criminal one. The proposal, as it slowly took shape, was that DeLorean would help finance the purchase of a large quantity of cocaine, something like 100 kilograms of it, worth in the region of $24 million on the street, in the hope of turning a profit vast enough to bring his company back from the grave. As much as $50 million, it was suggested. Enough, in theory, to raise Dunmurry from the dead. Enough to bring the workers back through the two gates. Enough to make the silver dream real again. The whole thing was a construction, engineered from the ground up. An FBI agent named Benedict Tisa posed as a crooked banker, offering DeLorean the respectable financial cover the scheme needed. At one point, the agents even offered to lend DeLorean the $2 million he could not raise himself. The government, in effect, financing the very crime it intended to arrest him for. Every step of the road was being laid down carefully in front of him by the same people who would be waiting at the end of it with the handcuffs. Whether that makes John DeLorean a criminal or the victim of an entrapment so complete it shocked a jury is a question the courts would spend a long time on, and we will come to their answer. But the decision to set his own foot on that road, whoever built it, that was his. On the evening of the 19th of October, 1982, John DeLorean flew from New York to Los Angeles and went up to room 501 of the Sheraton Plaza Lorena Hotel, close by the airport. A suitcase of cocaine was opened in front of him, and on the FBI's own surveillance video, played later at his trial for the whole world eventually to see, DeLorean lifts a package of the drug in his hand and says the words that would follow him to his grave, and beyond it. "It was better than gold," he said. "Gold weighs more than that, for God's sake." Champagne was poured, as if in celebration of a deal well done. And then the agents came through the door. One of them announced himself, FBI, and told John DeLorean that he was under arrest. Now, here is the thing the world got wrong, then and ever since. And here, of all places, we have to be truthful, because the truth is not the story you have been told, and the truth is worse. That very day, the 19th of October, was the day a final rescue deadline was expiring for the factory back in Belfast. And just hours before DeLorean was arrested in Los Angeles, the Northern Ireland Secretary had risen and announced the final rundown of the Dunmurry plant. The end had already been declared, formally, officially, that morning. So understand what the arrest did and did not do. It did not padlock the gates. It did not freeze a thriving factory in mid-motion. It did not send workers home from a running line. The factory had stopped making cars 5 months earlier, at the end of May. It had been in the hands of receivers for 8 months since February. The consortium rescue had already been refused by Thatcher. The final rundown had already been announced that very morning, before a single handcuff clicked shut across the Atlantic. What the arrest killed was not the factory. The factory was already a corpse. What the arrest killed was the last faint, flickering ghost of hope that something, somehow, might still be salvaged from the ruin. DeLorean's mad gamble in that hotel room had been, in his own doomed logic, a bid to raise the money to bring the dead back to life. When it ended in handcuffs on a hotel room carpet, it did not cause the death. It confirmed it. It slammed shut a door that was already all but closed, and it did so in the most public, most humiliating, most utterly irreversible way that could possibly be imagined. On videotape, before the eyes of the entire world. The dream did not die because of the cocaine. The dream was already dead. The cocaine was the sound of a desperate man trying to breathe life back into a body that had already gone cold, and being caught on camera in the act. Chapter 15. The gates close. The formal end came fast after that. Within days of the arrest, at the very end of October 1982, the DeLorean Motor Company filed for bankruptcy in the United States. The roughly 35 employees still on the books at Dunmurry, the last skeleton crew, keeping the lights on and the paperwork moving in a factory that had built nothing since May, were dismissed. The company was wound up. A few last part-finished cars, sitting orphaned on the line, would eventually be completed elsewhere by the American firm that bought up the remains. But the DeLorean Motor Company, as a living thing with a heartbeat, was finished. A dispatch filed from Dunmurry the day after the arrest caught the mood on the ground better than any official statement ever could. The handsome, sprawling new factory, the reporter wrote, stood idle. Workers went about the grim business of closing it down, and occasionally one of them would careen around the car park on what the reporter called a vengeful joyride, a last, furious lap of the place that had promised them the world, in one of the very cars their own hands had built. The people who spoke that day did not blame the cocaine. Read that again, because it matters. The men and women of Dunmurry, standing in the wreckage of their livelihoods on the morning after the most sensational drug arrest in America, did not point at the hotel room in Los Angeles. They pointed at London. It was not for want of fighting. Through that long, dying year, the workforce and their union representatives had done everything a workforce can do to save a plant. There had been the campaign to keep the gates open, the appeals to Westminster, the desperate hope pinned first on DeLorean's own £10 million deadline and then on the consortium rescue. Men like Brendan Mackin, the production foreman, had thrown themselves into the fight, not because they were political, but because this was their work, their wage, their standing in a city that measured a man by whether he had a job to go to. They had built a factory from a bog in 2 years. They believed, with some justice, that they could keep it alive if only someone in power would let them, and one by one, every door they pushed on had been quietly held shut from the other side. A production foreman named Brendan Mackin, a union man, 39 years old, who had fought hard to save the plant, found the whole thing ludicrous and depressing. And a worker named William Parker, 29, put the injustice of it as plainly and as devastatingly as anyone ever has. What happened to John DeLorean in America, he said, should have nothing to do with the DeLorean Motor Company in Belfast. They had done a good job here. They had built this factory in 2 years and they were producing good cars. And now? Now they were all on the dole. There were 30 men around here, he said, chasing every single new job that came up. He was right, and his rightness is the whole of the tragedy. The workers of Dunmurry had done nothing wrong. Their cars were good. Their line had run. Their skill was real and hard-earned. The two communities had held their fragile, extraordinary peace inside those walls for the entire life of the factory, through hunger strikes and walkouts and everything the Troubles could throw at them. And they lost everything anyway. Every bit of it. Not because of anything they had done, but because of money taken before they arrived, a market that never came, a government that ran out of patience, and a founder who, cornered and desperate, reached for the one door in the world that led straight to a prison cell. Some 350 local creditors were left owed more than $40 million between them. The suppliers, the small firms, the local businesses who had staked their own futures on the great silver dream. Northern Ireland's unemployment stood at around 23%, and in West Belfast far higher than that. The men and women who had crossed the peace lines to build the future of the motor car went back out that autumn, into a city that had no future to offer them at all. Chapter 16. Acquitted, but not innocent. There is a coda to the DeLorean story that the popular memory gets badly, stubbornly wrong. And it matters. It matters a great deal, because it is the difference between a man being cleared and a man simply not being convicted. DeLorean's trial on the cocaine charges opened in Los Angeles in the spring of 1984 and ran for months. His defense was led by a formidable attorney named Howard Weitzman, and Weitzman did something clever, something that turned the entire case on its head. He did not try to argue that his client had never touched the cocaine. The videotapes made that impossible. Instead, he put the government itself on trial. The argument was entrapment. The claim was that federal agents had found a desperate man at the lowest point of his life, and had dangled in front of him a crime he would never have devised on his own, had lent him the money to commit it, had built every step of the scheme, and had led him carefully by the hand to the hotel room where they were waiting to spring the trap. It was, Weitzman argued, a manufactured crime. The judge who presided over the trial gave the defense real ammunition. He condemned the chief informant, Hoffman, from the bench as a hired gun, and he found it deeply offensive that the prosecution had concealed the fact that Hoffman had demanded a personal cut of any money that was seized, that the government's star witness had a direct financial interest in DeLorean's downfall. The trial became a spectacle, as any trial with John DeLorean at its center was always going to. The informant Hoffman spent some 18 days on the witness stand, his credibility picked apart piece by piece. The prosecutors leaned on the videotapes, on DeLorean's own hand lifting the cocaine, on his own recorded words. One of them, James Walsh, memorably described DeLorean as a man with the conscience of a tomcat, but Weitzman kept the jury's eyes fixed not on his client, but on the machinery that had been built to catch him. In his closing, he reached, of all places, for George Orwell, for 1984, the very year they were sitting in. The whole premise of that book, he told them, was that the government rewrites history. The government controls people. The government stifles people. That was the frame he wanted in their minds as they retired to decide. On the 16th of August, 1984, after around 28.5 hours of deliberation spread over 7 days, the jury, 6 men and 6 women, acquitted John DeLorean on every count. As the verdicts were read out, DeLorean said, "Praise the Lord." It had been, he said afterward, an absolute horror, just like something out of Perry Mason. And in the years that followed, he was widely quoted when asked about his future in the motor trade, delivering the line that became almost a shorthand for the whole affair. "Would you," he supposedly asked, "buy a used car from me? It is a quip so perfect that historians have never been able to pin it firmly to a single contemporary source. But it stuck to him regardless, because it caught something true about how the world had come to see him." But listen, really listen, to what the jurors themselves said afterward, because it is emphatically not what the world chose to remember. They did not say he was innocent. Not one of them said that. One juror said that many of the government's actions in the case had simply not been appropriate. Another said, with a bluntness that ought to have echoed longer than it did, that if there had not been entrapment, there would at the very least have been a hung jury. They acquitted John DeLorean because they believed the government had behaved improperly in creating the crime, not because they believed he was a man who would never, under any circumstances, have committed it. He was found to have been entrapped. That is a verdict about the conduct of the FBI. It is not, and was never meant to be, a certificate of the man's good character. And then there was the other trial. The one about the money, the one that, for Belfast, was the trial that truly mattered. DeLorean was tried in Detroit over the GPD fraud, the $17.5 million, the Geneva apartment, the money that might have saved the factory. And there too, in December 1986, he walked free, acquitted on all counts. But the reasons for that acquittal are grim, and they are nothing like innocence. The prosecution had been crippled from the start by a single brute fact. Colin Chapman, DeLorean's alleged partner in the whole scheme, the other principal hand in the till, had died suddenly of a heart attack back in December 1982, only weeks after DeLorean's arrest. A dead man cannot testify. A dead man cannot be cross-examined, cannot be turned, cannot corroborate. Some jurors were reportedly confused by the judge's instructions, and so DeLorean slipped the net a second time. But we know it was fraud. We know it because the court said so plainly about the one man who lived to be sentenced for it. Fred Bushell, the Lotus finance director, the careful, quiet man who had helped move the money, pleaded guilty. And in 1992, he was sent to prison for 3 years. The judge who sentenced Bushell, sitting in Belfast, said something extraordinary about the 2 men who were not in the dock beside him. He described the scheme Chapman had perpetrated as a bare-faced, outrageous and massive fraud. And he stated, from the bench, for the permanent record, that both Chapman and DeLorean would each have received at least 10 years in prison had they ever stood trial before him. Colin Chapman's estate later quietly settled with the British government for nearly £5 million, the closest thing to an admission that the dead man's affairs would ever provide. So this is the truth to hold, carefully and completely, At the end of it all, John DeLorean was never convicted of a crime. Not once, in all the years and all the courtrooms. But he was never exonerated either, and the two things are not the same. On the drugs, he was found to have been entrapped, freed because the government had overreached, not because he was clean. On the money, he escaped conviction largely because his alleged co-conspirator was in his grave, and a judge who examined the fraud in full stated, for the record, that DeLorean deserved a decade behind bars. He simply never served a day of it. Chapter 17. What remains? The site at Dunmurry did not stay empty for long. In 1989, a French company called Montupet took over the factory and began making cast aluminium cylinder heads there, components for other people's engines, turned out in the great echoing halls where the stainless dream had so briefly lived. By the middle of the 2010s, it employed more than 600 people. Good jobs, real work, life returning to the reclaimed bog at the cuts. And the old DeLorean test track survives to this day, opened up now and again for reunions, when the enthusiasts and the old workers bring their surviving cars back to the place where they were born and run them once more around the circuit their own hands helped to build. Around 6,500 DeLoreans are believed to survive, out of the roughly 9,000 ever made. And that is the great, strange, aching irony that sits at the very center of the whole story. Because in 1985, just 3 years after the Dunmurry line fell silent, a film came out that made the DeLorean immortal. The makers of Back to the Future chose the car for a reason that was almost absurdly simple. With those gull-wing doors thrown open, they thought, it would look to an ordinary family in 1955 exactly like a spacecraft come down from the sky. And so, the DMC-12, the commercial catastrophe, the car that bankrupted a company and helped destroy 2,500 livelihoods on a fault line in Belfast, became one of the most beloved machines in the entire history of cinema. Children who had not yet been born when the factory closed grew up desperate to own one. The car became a symbol, not of failure, but of pure possibility, of the future itself, flying across the screen in a blaze of light. John DeLorean himself wrote to the filmmakers in July 1985 to thank them for immortalizing his car. Think on that for just a moment. The car flew across cinema screens all over the world, cheered by audiences who had not the faintest idea that the hands which built it had gone silent 3 years before the film ever began. That the people of Twinbrook and Seymour Hill, who had fitted those famous, magical, upward-swinging doors, were, by the time the world fell in love with their work, long since back on the dole in a city that had nothing else to give them. As for the man himself, John DeLorean fought some 40 legal cases in the years that followed his acquittals. He declared bankruptcy in 1999. He sold his sprawling New Jersey estate to a property developer named Donald Trump, who turned it into a golf course. He died in 2005 at the age of 80, and on his gravestone, carved into the stone above him, is the image of a gull-wing DeLorean, its doors raised to the sky, forever. But the last word does not belong to him. It cannot belong to him. It belongs to the workers. And the truest thing anyone ever said about them came from a historian named Nick Sutton, who cut clean through all the glamour and all the scandal and all the myth to name the real losers of the story. It was not John DeLorean, he said. DeLorean was declared bankrupt but landed, as such men so often do, on his feet. It was not the management team, many of whom found other jobs soon enough. The losers were the 2,500 employees at Dunmurry, and of them, in Sutton's plain and quietly devastating words, many of them never worked again. There was one final indignity, small and cold and telling. Years after the gates closed for good, the British authorities sequestrated close to £1 million of what was called surplus from the DeLorean employees' pension fund. Even in death, the enterprise reached back and took something more from the very people who had built it. Walk the ground at Dunmurry today, and you will find a working factory, French-owned, humming with the honest business of cylinder heads. You would never know what stood there before. There is no great monument to the stainless dream, no Titanic Belfast for the car, though Barry Wills spent years of his life asking for one, just the test track and the fading memories of old men who once had a fantastic time building the future, and a scattering of silver cars around the world. Some of them, perhaps, still carrying a small candle scratched in barbed wire behind the dashboard. in a place where no owner will ever think to look. The most futuristic car on Earth. Built by hands, the world had already written off, on a fault line in the middle of a war, in a factory that rose from a bog in 28 months and fell silent again in barely 14. It did not fail because of one man's night in a hotel room in Los Angeles. It failed the way these things nearly always seem to fail, slowly and then all at once, through money that vanished, and patience that ran dry, and an arithmetic that never, from the very first day, actually worked. The handcuffs made the headlines. They always do, but the factory was already gone by then, and the people who built it deserved, at the very least, to be remembered as something more than a footnote to the crime of the man whose name they had worn on their overalls. They built something beautiful. For one bright year, against every odd and every expectation, it worked. That should be enough to remember them by.